comes a whiz bang, hush. Here comes a whiz bang. Now you soldier men, get down those stairs, down in your dugouts and say your prayers. Hush.
On the morning of 17th September 1916, Private Harry Farr said, "No. No, sir," he said. He was not willing to go to battle on the front lines in the Battle of the Somme. No, sir, because he was unwell. He'd been unwell for months, in and out of hospital, including once for 5 whole months at a stretch. No, sir, he was not physically wounded, but, sir, he didn't want to go back to battle because, in his own words, sir, he couldn't stand it. Upon hearing this, his commanding officer, Regimental Sergeant Major Hanks, went bonkers. He's reported to have used a lot, and I mean a lot, of swear words. The essence of that response was, "If you don't go, son, I will shoot your brains out for cowardice myself." Sergeant Major Hanks got a corporal to try to physically force Private Harry Farr to return to the front, but Farr resisted. A fight broke out between Farr and the corporal. Private Farr eventually wiggled free, and with nothing else for it, ran away. He deserted. A day later, Harry was found and arrested. He was charged with cowardice, and he was court-martialed. Eventually, Harry Farr was found guilty and sentenced to death. And so it was 1 month after his desertion. Harry Farr was shot at dawn by a firing squad made up of 12 men from his own regiment. He was offered a blindfold, but he declined it. He said he wanted to look his own men in the eyes when they shot him.
Aim! Fire!
Harry Farr was shot for, quote, cowardice. But he was no coward. We can see now that he was suffering from shell shock. It's a term we're familiar with now, even if it's not used so much these days. Shell shock refers to the largely psychological trauma that results from being exposed to the extreme stress of battle, especially when you're under bombardment from heavy artillery or shells. Shell shock left you with a lot of physical symptoms, shaking, trembling, or even paralysis, to say nothing of the emotional problems, nightmares and flashbacks and distress. And poor Harry was in and out of hospital for the symptoms of shell shock for ages before his eventual desertion. His wife, Gertrude, later recalled that
he shook all the time. He couldn't stand the noise of the guns. We got a letter from him, but it was in a stranger's handwriting. He could write perfectly well, but couldn't hold the pen because his hand was shaking.
Shell shock was a new idea. There weren't shells, right? Until the First World War, not really. And it was terribly understood at the time. There are elements of it that is physical, like damage to the eardrums for being so close to bombs. But these days we would mostly consider shell shock to be a form of what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. But back then, 100 plus years ago, it was seen as a sign of weakness, a sign of flimsiness and cowardice, something that could be dangerously contagious and spread between the soldiers on the front. And it had to be stamped out, as this episode's guest explains.
In the First World War, people had never seen warfare like this before. You're stuck in trenches, you can't fight, and you can't, at certain points, and you can't flee. And it put an incredible strain on the nervous system. And yet, when people suffered from shell shock and what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, there was absolutely no empathy or no sympathy at all. The senior military leaders thought it was just evidence of bad breeding. It was,
That's Professor Geoff Beattie. You're going to hear a lot more from Geoff, and I'll explain who the hell he is in a minute.
Treatments for shell shock for the rank and file troops were just barbaric. The commonest symptom of shell shock was mutism. People couldn't speak at all. So the treatment, extraordinarily, was they put electrodes into the mouth and give people electric shocks until they made noises. And when you read the accounts of the dealing with psychological trauma, I mean, it is extraordinary when you look back, because, 1918 it is a long time ago, but, it's not that long ago. As you get older, it certainly is not long ago.
In 2006, as a result of a long campaign from Harry Farr's granddaughter to have his name cleared, he was posthumously pardoned, along with 305 other soldiers who were all thought to have been executed for this thing called cowardice, when in fact it was shell shock. PTSD is now pretty widely understood, and we've got a very different attitude to it these days. Not that you can't still find plenty of people who think it's something only snowflakes have, of course, but we're getting there. In 1980, PTSD was included formally in a thing called the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. The DSM is the official list from the American Psychiatric Association of recognised psychological conditions like depression, schizophrenia, ADHD, and a great deal more besides. Now, in the DSM are a lot of anxiety
Fear of flying,
disorders.
Fear of heights, fear of spiders, social anxiety disorder, panic disorder.
But there's one type of anxiety you may have heard a lot about, which you won't currently find in the latest edition of the DSM.
Despite President Trump calling climate change the greatest con job ever at the UN General Assembly this week, more than 63% of US adults are worried about global warming. This is according to a study from the Yale Program on Climate Change Communications. And as extreme weather becomes more common, some experts are warning it may impact your mental health as well.
Climate anxiety. A thing that maybe 30, maybe 20, maybe even 10 years ago wouldn't really have been seen as a thing. A sense of panic, powerlessness, dread, and of course anxiety, loads of other stuff besides, that feels like it is specifically to do with what humans are doing to the planet. More and more people report it. And to those that feel like they experience it, including, I'm going to level with you, me, it feels real enough, let me assure you. But there's a lot of debate about it. Some people say it's real. Other people say it's not real, or if it is, it's not a distinctly real thing from lots of other anxieties. I'm Dave. Hello. Welcome to Your Brain on Climate, the show about human brains versus the climate crisis. Or perhaps this episode, I should say the climate crisis versus human brains, because we're going to look at the phenomenon of climate anxiety. Is it a real thing? There's a lot of debate about that. Some people say it is, some people say it isn't. Some people come down somewhere in the middle. If it is a real thing, I want to know how big a problem it is for people who suffer it. And if it is a big problem, short of ending the climate crisis itself, what the hell should we do about it?
Your brain on climate.
In this episode, I'm joined, as you've heard already, by Professor Geoff Beattie. Geoff is Professor of Psychology at Edge Hill University in the UK. He is a prestigious geezer with more awards and quivers to his bow than you could point a microphone at. You might also have seen him as the on-screen telepsychologist on the UK version of Big Brother. Geoff has written about all sorts of things. His latest book, called Understanding Climate Anxiety, is all about, well, how to understand climate anxiety. And so I got him on and I talked to him about it, including whether it's real or not. Now, before we get started, the housekeeping. Thanks to everyone who reviews this show on things like Apple Podcasts. It really makes a huge difference, not just to my morale, but also to the profile of the show, more importantly. Please do take 30 seconds, write a quick review, and give it a 5-star rating. This is a listener-supported show, and a huge thanks to the kind souls that keep this show on the road. You can join them at patreon.com/yourbrainonclimate. If you like what I do and you want to say thanks, a couple of quid a month would help hugely. This is, please remember, a humble one-man operation. I do all the work and I pay my guests for their precious time. And speaking of show notes, remember when you hear this noise, it denotes wisdom. It means someone, probably in this case Geoff, has said something wise and clever, and if you look in the show notes, you will find more information about it. Okay, on with it. So here's Geoff explaining what the hell climate anxiety actually is.
I think part of the problem with climate anxiety is it's used very broadly and used very broadly in psychological literature. Even if you go to everyday dictionaries and look it up, it's defined differently. Sometimes there's kind of worry, sometimes there's anxiety, sometimes emotionally. Psychologists often define it in terms of either negative emotion, but sometimes they're much more specific in terms of it has to be at a level which impacts on daily life, functional impairment. It impacts on sleep, study, and work, and so on. So it is used, it is either defined very broadly, i.e. any negative emotional effect of thinking about climate change, or even just a simple response to the question, do you worry about what's happening to the climate? But sometimes very, very specifically and defined in terms of a number of set criteria. And the reason that's a problem is that the reported incidence of climate anxiety varies enormously from study to study. So sometimes it seems very, very high. With other studies, it seems quite low because they're either using a very broad definition or a very specific one. And of course, the problem with that is that it's kind of fuel to the anti-climate change believers, the disbelievers, who say, well, look, they can't even agree on how common this thing is or a set definition. I think the other problem with the term climate anxiety is that, anxiety in some sense is a very useful word because it's kind of about a diffuse kind of fear. Fears tends to be fear of something. And anxiety is anxiety about something, but it's quite diffuse as well. And there's this really interesting issue, again, which I do discuss, which is what types of anxiety is it most similar to? So,
right.
Because you can get anxious about an examination, say, or anxious about a driving test, or you can be anxious about everything generally. And it's really interesting. In the book, I kind of go to the NHS helpline for a bit of help with anxiety. And I think, okay, let's see what they say. And of course, when you get on to generalized anxiety disorder, they talk about issues to do with your own past, which may have given rise to this. In other words, it's something internal to you. You're kind of, this shouldn't be happening, therefore it's you. Now, of course, climate anxiety is different to that. It's not me, it's what's happening to the world, actually. So it's a kind of unique, kind of weird anxiety. And that's why, psychologists are in such massive disagreement about whether it should or should not be in the diagnostic and statistical manual, because if you put it in, then you're saying, well, it's a form of, it's to do with mental health. Well, at some level, of course it is. But another level, it's saying, would you want people to think, well, you're suffering from poor mental health because of you rather than because of the situation? So it's got that kind of interesting problem of alignment with other types of anxiety. But what, and again, when you read models of, psychological models of anxiety, in terms of, the famous kind of Aaron Beck type work, they talk about overestimation of, part of the issue to do with anxiety is overestimation of the threat from certain things. But again, when it comes to climate anxiety, how could you overestimate the threat of what's going to happen if things continue as they are? So it just seems to me, it's a problematic term in so many senses, in terms of the breadth of the definition, in terms of how we think about anxiety normally, and what does it align with, and so on. So some people have suggested, well, and one of my favorite quotes is, it's not a mental health issue, but it needs to be treated as such, which again kind of recognizes this contradictory nature of the whole thing. You need to help people who suffer from climate anxiety, but not treat it as ill mental health. So as a term, it is layers of complexity. And again, what I try to do in the book is to talk about things that one may do, which could help at the individual level without going down this kind of diagnostic route.
My guest on this episode of Your Brain on Climate is Professor Geoff Beattie. He's written a book about climate anxiety. You'll have heard him say, look, it is real, but it's somewhere in between a mental health problem and a grim social reality. And even he thinks it could be quite a hard thing to pin down and describe. But it makes me think a bit of the judge who famously said in the 60s he couldn't define obscenity, but he knows it when he sees it. Or in the words of Rodney from Only Fools and Horses, we don't need a weatherman to tell us when it's pissing down. there's something there. For me, at least, there's definitely something going on. Cards on the table, whatever it is, this climate anxiety thing, I get it. I certainly feel like I feel some kind of deep worry about climate change that just isn't the same as my deep worries about other stuff. I actually wrote about this 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, something like that. I'll put a link in the show notes. I'm not a particularly anxious person, I don't think. Maybe my wife or colleagues or Kat would tell you otherwise. But if I sit down and think about what we're doing to the planet, which is, the only place in the universe we can live, without which we wouldn't be alive in the first place, it makes me feel some kind of combination of vertigo and being out of my depth in the sea, and also a kind of vast, overpowering cognitive dissonance that can make me feel a bit sick and scared. And I've got to be honest, from my perspective, if climate and all the rest of it don't make you feel a little bit, at the least, kind of clammy, I'm not 100% sure you've been paying attention. But yet, that, in my world at least, is still quite a taboo thing to say, weirdly. I've worked for 20 years in organisations full of people immersed in the horrible climate science and the horribleness of trying to get change to happen. And I think, honestly, I can count the times that I've had a conversation about, isn't this all really, really bad? Doesn't it make you feel worried? Doesn't it make you feel upset? How are you doing? I honestly think I've had that kind of chat with colleagues no more than 5 times in all of those 2 decades. So whatever it is, climate anxiety still feels like it's got some parallels to how shell shock was thought about in World War I. Private Harry Farr, who we talked about earlier, was one of 300 soldiers shot for cowardice while suffering from what we now know to be shell shock, and back then it was really poorly understood and very taboo. But being terrified and traumatised by having heavy artillery fired at your head doesn't seem that irrational to me.
It's not that surprising that people have got a very negative psychological reaction to what's going on, because in 2007, I was pretty optimistic about change. I started working with some organizations that were going to affect big change at the level of the individual. The idea was that there was going to be a revolution in consumer habits if people just got the right information. And it was all about just getting information to people, and then things would change. And I was terribly optimistic at that point. I thought, oh God, I'm at the start of a revolution. Here I am in the Royal Society, and we're going to change the world. And I did some psychological research around the issue. And part of the revolution was to be guided by carbon labeling. The idea was if people just got information about the carbon footprint of products, they would buy the low carbon items because it would work with other things on food, other labels like fat information or calorie information. But the problem is it didn't work. And I did some work at the time in which I tracked people looking at products. They never looked at the carbon label. And I found that quite depressing. But even more depressing was the fact that everyone said they cared deeply. And if they just got the information, they would do it. But they weren't doing it. And that got me really interested in basically how the brain works, how the mind works, how we process information, what judgments we make. And that got me thinking about, when we think about ourselves and we think about our decision making, we think we're terribly rational and we're going to make rational decisions all the time. And unfortunately, we don't. And I think one consequence of that is that people, in a sense, know that we're faced with this existential crisis, and people at all levels, people in the street, to organizations, politicians, to world leaders, aren't doing enough. In some sense, climate anxiety is the obvious consequence of all that. And it's a very serious issue for many people. Made worse by the fact that if you ever talk about climate anxiety to people, this is just my experience, people think you're weak in some way. And that's why I wanted to explore it in book form. I wanted to write about how it feels, where it comes from, what we can do about it, why there's such a stigma around it, and whether all these things like the value action gap, that we express certain values but don't act on them, in some sense is contributing to it. Because obviously if you think that people are saying the right things but you know they're not going to act, that just makes your anxiety worse. So that was the point of the book. I mean, to me it's one of the really significant crises we're facing at this point in time. Not just climate change, which of course is existential, but also people's psychological response to it, which is a massive issue. And I suspect when we talk about how prevalent it is, sometimes I think we're probably underestimating it, because in my experience, when I try to tell people, I don't necessarily get the most positive response.
So I guess we can talk a bit about kind of a diagnostic level, and we can be, one can be very sort of academic and looking down the end of a telescope about this stuff. But what is it? Do you have climate anxiety, and how does that feel for you? How does that show up in your life?
Well, it is interesting. Like a lot of people, I find my climate anxiety has kind of got worse as the years go by, when I realized that things are not kind of changing. In me, it's kind of manifested. Well, just let me say, like a lot of people, I suffer from a lot, but I've never considered myself an anxious person until the last short while. And I just think we're living in a kind of terribly uncertain world at the moment. What's happening in Gaza, what's happening in Ukraine. There's a lot of stuff going on at the moment, which is likely to induce high levels of anxiety. So climate anxiety is kind of in the mix there. And again, in the book, I'm really interested in whether there's a finite pool of things you can worry about. What happens when something else comes in? So in that context, my climate anxiety, I wouldn't say it waxes and wanes, but I can certainly feel it more intensely when I'm not so worried about Putin and Ukraine and what's going to happen next and so on, because there's just so much concern. In terms of my own experience, I would say it's a feeling of helplessness at the moment. I would say it makes me sad. It makes me depressed on occasion when I hear people talking about it. I think when I see organizations promoting things which they claim are very good in terms of the climate, and I think maybe they're overstating the case, I think that depresses me as well. And I think as a psychologist, my feelings about, I can't understand why organizations and politicians have been so naive about what would be required to produce change.
I should be back in school on the other side of the ocean. Yet you all come to us young people for hope. How dare you?
Now, Geoff and I are not young people. But when you think climate anxiety, probably the demographic that most pops into your head is young people, for good reason. In a recent multinational survey of 10,000 young people in different countries, nearly 2/3 of them said they were worried or extremely worried about climate change. Over half of them said that climate change made them feel all of the following things: sad, angry, powerless, helpless, and guilty. And perhaps more debilitatingly, nearly half of them said how they think about climate change is negatively affecting their daily life. And I've seen that echoed in other studies. I've also seen some stats showing that climate change concern in younger generations, at least here in the UK, is beginning to drop off a bit, but still relative to other cohorts, they're the most likely to report that they are worried, which makes sense, right? Because they're the ones with most at stake when a planet goes on fire. But does that mean climate anxiety is necessarily just a young person thing?
I think all the research suggests it is more prevalent in young people. And I suspect, I suppose I'm always reminded that human beings are very biased in the way they think about the world. And there are two kinds of biases they suffer from, particularly relevant to climate change, which is spatial bias and temporal bias. So I think for years, when we did research on this, we asked people about how is climate change going to impact on people's lives. And I think what people, generally speaking, thought was it would affect other places, not here, distant places, islands in the South Pacific, and the temporal bias, which is, hey, it'll not be in the next decade or so. My children or my grandchildren will be impacted. And in some sense, they were the security blanket they were using. They were using these kind of cognitive biases to make themselves feel less anxious. I think the problem now is that the situation's changed. I mean, I started the book talking about my emotional response to what happened in Valencia last summer, with the floods and the mud of Valencia. And obviously it was a major, the images were on our televisions. And the reason I found that emotional was that it's not just that suddenly, we've got climate change in Europe and we've got climate change now, not in the future. I suppose what really affected me was watching ordinary people having to deal with it. There was a very slow response from the authorities there. And it was the young people and older people turning up with their buckets and spades and shoveling the mud into buckets. And I found that a very emotional image, I think, which was, this wasn't any kind of abstract thing about climate change. This is the reality. And who's going to end up having to deal with it? Well, ordinary people, actually, because it's going to impact on their lives. And of course, it's ordinary people in the global south who are having to deal with it today. And it's not for our children or grandchildren. This is happening now. And we really, really do need to think, we need to focus on this issue and do something. So I think things like that have removed the security blanket of the cognitive biases that some people had, which was, hey, our children and grandchildren. So I think people of all generations now are getting more anxious about it. But of course, it always makes a lot of sense that young people might well feel more anxious because they know they're here for a longer period of time. In their lifetime, this is going to get much, much worse. And I think, of course, with Greta Thunberg, they had a spokesperson who was speaking to them and giving them a clear and distinctive message. And I think she was widely listened to, and there was no ambiguity about the message. There was no hedging of the message. And again, I'm really interested in the fact that Greta obviously seems to spend a lot of time now talking about other things, but nevertheless, and again, I'm interested in what happens to people if you think you have a leader, a spokesperson, when they kind of move on. But the message is stuck in your head. I don't think that necessarily helps. And I also think that the message, our house is on fire, I think a fear response like that, I think an extreme fear message, we know from psychology, doesn't really work in terms of people's actions, because you're not telling them, you're not reassuring them that there are things they can do that would make a difference. You're not dealing with their personal perceived efficacy and the so-called self-efficacy. And you're not telling them what they should do. And psychological research suggests that if you just frighten people, they find other ways of dealing with it, including, just suppressing the idea. They refuse to think about it at all. And we've got all kinds of unconscious ways of avoiding bad messages. But nevertheless, I think Greta's message stuck with a lot of people, but they weren't entirely sure what to do in their own lives that could make a difference. I mean, obviously there were protests for quite a while, Extinction Rebellion and so on. But again, that seems to have changed a bit, with the full force of, the law and government and so on. But I suppose it's leaving this set of cognitions, thoughts and feelings which are not necessarily positive within individuals, particularly in young people.
One criticism I have heard of, I don't know whether it's of the idea of climate anxiety or the term climate anxiety, it comes from people speaking from a global perspective, global south perspective, who say that white Western people sitting around moaning about having climate anxiety isn't just like a distraction, but it's actively insulting to the people in the global south who are getting on with living with it and not having a particularly great time either. And I've sort of called it almost like an indulgence, a luxury. And I'm wondering what you make of that charge.
Well, I can understand why people say it, but of course, people in the global south also suffer from intense levels of climate anxiety, because they're being directly affected, and also they've got what people in the rich Western nations see as well, which is the kind of bigger, a picture which involves people in other nations. Some people have done some research on this recently, looking at how different types of global features impact on anxiety in different places. I think countries looked at were countries like China, South Africa, and so on. So a range of countries, also Western nations like Portugal, the US, and the UK. And of course, what's really interesting is that there is differences and discrepancies in levels of anxiety about particular things depending upon location. But nevertheless, climate anxiety comes out pretty high. Wars, but not surprisingly, the war in Ukraine, etc., comes out highest in terms of worry, anxiety, and so on. But climate change is high. And of course, as a measure and as a way of thinking about it, it's going to be incredibly high in the global south. I know there's a lot of ongoing research on this at the moment as well, because if it's impacting on you having to leave your homeland or change your everyday life now, not in the future, then of course it's going to produce incredible levels of anxiety and so on. But you can also see the point, which is, listen, I'm having to deal with this now, and you're just worried about the future. Because I think that's one of the criticisms of, critics of climate anxiety would probably say this. The concept of pre-traumatic stress disorder has been introduced in the last few years. And again, some interesting work on that, because I think now we look back on 1918 and the aftermath of the First World War as barbaric times, and we fully recognize the importance of post-traumatic stress disorder. But the concept of pre-traumatic stress disorder, could you have something as intense about something that hasn't happened yet? And there have been now measures which have used the same kinds of questions used to measure PTSD, but just reversed temporally, about flashbacks and nightmares and effects on daily life, which seems to suggest that it can produce things of a very high order of intensity. Now, some people will object to that and say, well, if you've been through a trauma, I live in a particular place in the global south, and I've seen it firsthand. How can you in the West say that you're experiencing something similar to something that hasn't happened yet? But nevertheless, there is evidence to suggest that it can produce incredibly high levels of anxiety in individuals.
Telling someone they shouldn't feel anxious about something doesn't seem like it achieves anything to me. It feels ungenerous of someone's state of mind, but it also feels like that's not how anxiety works, right? Like if you're anxious about your house burning down because you've got a loose plug in your house or whatever, and I tell you, Geoff, don't worry about it, don't be anxious, it's not going to work, is it?
Yeah. Again, the whole business of the stigma about climate anxiety, I addressed several times in the book, including in the final chapter, which was because I'd been researching it for a while, I became really sensitive to every time it came up in conversation, really. And I do tell quite a funny story of having dinner in Gothenburg with an old friend of mine who's a very eminent logician. And we started talking about climate anxiety. Well, it was quite amusing in a way, because I've always really respected this guy. I'll not mention him by name, but he was dead against it. It was like this white privilege stuff that some people moan about. And it was so interesting hearing his take on it, really. The funniest bit was he kept saying to me over dinner, he wanted to order from me. He said, "You need more Viking food," because I think he thought I wasn't Viking enough at that point. It's like, once you start talking about climate anxiety, you need to change your diet. Man up a bit, I think he was saying. But there is a powerful stigma about it. And again, I think that stigma doesn't help the experience of it. And when you have Donald Trump saying it's fake news and a Chinese conspiracy, it's all a hoax, that doesn't help. So telling people to get over it, telling people to man up, eat Viking food, or telling people to just recognize that you're responding to a hoax here, you realize that, don't you? None of it helps. So I think we have to find, we have to allow people to have some ownership of how they feel about things, recognize that these things can have what psychologists like to call functional impairments in everyday life, impacting on their sleep, their work, their study, what they do, what they think about. And we have to suggest things that they can do to help them. But nevertheless, use, but not eradicate anxiety altogether. We want people to be anxious, but in a positive way, which will lead to action and lead to pressure on governments and organizations to change what they do. So it has to be channeled.
Your brain on climate.
I don't want to go to war. I'd rather stay at home.
Welcome back to Your Brain on Climate. I'm Dave, and in this episode I'm talking about climate anxiety with Professor Geoff Beattie. So, SITREP, I don't know quite whether we have established that climate anxiety is a discrete, real thing. Geoff thinks it's something distinct, though, to like anxiety. And there are mental health elements to it for sure, but it is more complicated than that. And what Geoff is saying is, like, a large part of the climate anxiety bit is not a disorder. It's not irrational to feel like you feel anxious about the planet to be on fire. And nor is it irrational to look at the responses of our leaders and our society at large and each other and feel like, shit, we really might not get a handle on this, you know. Also, though, it's hard to separate it from worries about all the rest of the shit going on. One recent study in the UK shows that despite young people saying climate anxiety is a big thing for them, when you actually dig into it, their mental health is bad in general. And there are other things like loneliness, money worries, health concerns that turn out to be a much bigger concern in practice than climate anxiety. Researchers teased all these things out, and they found that when you take these other worries into account, climate anxiety by itself has, quote, little or no effect on the overall well-being or sleep of the people in the study. And there's something interesting happening here, right? Well, if you ask young people in this case, if climate change worries are affecting their mental health, we know that nearly half of them say yes. But that doesn't, in practice, mean that's what's really going on. If there's one message I hope you've taken from this show over the years, it's that what people say in response to opinion polls about climate change does not always reveal what they really actually think or how they behave.
What makes him think that?
Well, the party have had an opinion poll done. It seems all the voters are in favour of bringing back national service.
Well, I have another opinion poll done showing the voters are against bringing back national service.
So look, you're not going to find climate anxiety at the moment in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It is not enough of a thing. But then again, neither are you going to find lots of other things that feel real enough to people that suffer from them. For example, there's coulrophobia, the fear of clowns. It's not particularly rational to be scared of clowns, I don't think, although more people than you would think are, apparently. And I've got a friend who's got a thing called trypophobia. Anyway, it's the fear of lots of tiny holes in things, like a sponge or a honeycomb. Don't think that's particularly rational either. So the brain is complicated. So look, is it real? I don't know. But Geoff thinks, and this is the important point, it is real enough in terms of how it manifests for us to take it seriously and not just to tell people to man up and get on with things. And even more importantly, actually to try to do something about it. And so if Geoff thinks that, that's probably good enough for us for now. So what then should we do about it?
We have to be aware that when we're trying to promote behaviour change linked to climate, we have to perhaps think about how to promote it in a way that people can think about the positive benefits, the hope aspects, the fact that something's doable. And from what I'm saying, you can see that this inevitably leads to a discussion of climate anxiety, because part of the problem with climate anxiety is once that anxiety level kicks in, then people start feeling more helpless and there's nothing they can do. And there's a form of maladaptive anxiety which stops people even trying, and that's why I wrote the book, really, to say, look, what can really be done? Part of the mantra in the book is that change needs to start with the individual, and what can individuals do? How can they feel better about it? How can they motivate themselves more? And how can they start thinking about climate action, not just their thoughts and feelings? How do we get people to move from just the thoughts, knowing climate change is a bad thing, we need to do more, to actually doing more? So that got me doing a lot of research on what are called implicit attitudes, which are kind of unconscious attitudes we hold to certain kinds of things. And these implicit attitudes are a set of associations we have. And, my starting point is, look, we've had, since the Second World War, decade after decade of advertising, influencing how we feel about cars, fancy holidays, clothes. Advertising is based on that whole concept, and they do it very well. And then what we're asking people is to start thinking differently about the same kinds of things. But I'm saying that cannot just be a kind of rational decision. We have to do more. So we started working in schools in the Northwest, in the Liverpool region. We started trying to get kids to think about, started with kids thinking about climate change, And we got them to engage in various creative activities to get them more emotionally connected with the whole thing. So they would do drawings, paintings, stories, all kinds of stuff. Rap. We had some good raps about climate change. But the idea was to think about putting sustainability and climate change into the curriculum, but in a slightly more creative way, a slightly more engaging way. And then we tried to measure change within the kids. And that was quite interesting because we did see behavioral change in families. The kids were putting stickers up by the light switch saying, please switch me off. We're not, all that kind of stuff. And we thought that was one way of trying to get people to think about, and then we tried to measure their behavioral change and what they were doing differently about how they wanted to get to school and all that kind of stuff. But then we suddenly thought, could these kids be role models for their parents? Because they were already saying that the parents were quite surprised at some of the things they were saying. So we made a little film about the educational program, which we then played to adults from the same communities. And these were working class communities in the Northwest. Because again, it was to try and get away from this notion that climate change, well, it's a kind of young person, sensitive young person, middle class, blah, blah, blah. Listen, this is something that involves all of us. And the films were quite emotional for the parents, actually, and from the adults from the community, because they got kind of angry about climate change. They felt disgusted by climate change. So we managed to produce some kind of emotional response. Now, the reason that I thought that was a way to think about producing change was it seems to me that emotional connection with climate change needs to be done, but in a particular way, not just making people anxious or frightened, but making them feel different types of emotions which can be harnessed to produce actions. Because the problem with, the kind of underlying pieces is that, listen, the human mind has got different systems of cognition. The unconscious system is very emotionally based. It can lead to action, but it needs to be emotions of a particular kind. So I started thinking that part of the solution has to be closing the value action gap. There's no point in us all sitting around saying that we care about this, but not doing anything. And I think the way it's been done, the way it was done with tobacco, certainly, and the way it's been done with other things like fancy holidays and fancy cars, as they work on the emotional system, we have to get that emotional system engaged here, because that can be our guidance in choosing and having direct effects. The other thing that we did, which was slightly different, was using kids as the spokespersons, not Al Gore with all his hypocrisy, or not Leonardo DiCaprio, but kids from the community saying, this is the problem, this is what we're trying to do, what are you trying to do? And this wasn't Greta Thunberg. These were just ordinary local kids. So that was one way of trying to kind of fix one aspect of what I see as the climate change issue, which is we know it's bad. We still feel this pull towards certain kinds of activities which maybe are not the best in the world we live in. So how do we do this? That was one thing. Another thing was, and you've kind of you kind of mentioned this yourself in your own life, which is you don't like to talk about it, because you're absolutely right. If I was talking to students about it, you have to be very sensitive, because you can make them much worse by talking about this. There's no question about that. And I think we become very buttoned up about it sometimes. I do find myself being very careful about what I say to many people. And it's not just for fear of being accused of being overly sensitive or anything. I think it's because, as you say, you have to take into account other people's sensitivities. But over the years, I have done a lot of work on inhibition of negative thoughts connected with traumatic experiences. And of course, the problem is that's the worst thing you can do, because if you don't talk about things, if you don't express them, everything's just bottled up inside. And then, of course, that's why you go to bed at night and suddenly you can't sleep, because all these kind of inhibited thoughts are banging up against each other, and you're thinking, oh God, So and there's a lot of interesting psychology from an American psychologist called James Pennebaker, who's looked at the effects of emotional disclosure on expressing kind of negative emotions about certain kinds of events, certain kinds of traumatic events. And climate change, I would say, is a very traumatic event. And he says, look, you can ask people just simply to write about how, their thoughts and feelings about it. Because what you're doing when you're writing about it, or of course speaking about it, if you can find someone to speak to about it, is that you're connecting up your thoughts and feelings in a way that allows you to understand the connections, allows you to express things that otherwise you're completely inhibiting. And again, there's extraordinary psychological evidence about the positive beneficial effects of that, both psychologically and physically, on individuals. It decreases stress levels enormously.
To begin, how to start. I'm hungry. I should get coffee. Coffee would help me think. But I should write something first, then reward myself with coffee. Coffee and a muffin.
What I was trying to think about was things you could recommend to people to do in their everyday lives, which is, how do you get yourself in a position where you just don't have the thoughts, you're liable to act on them, and how do you get people to deal with aspects of climate anxiety, which is thoughts and feelings which are disconnected, fragmented, they're in your head. You need to organize them. The simplest way is get a bit of paper and write about them on consecutive days. Let them evolve over consecutive days as you write down about how you feel and so on. And these sound like ridiculously, panaceas for something as deep as climate change. But I keep thinking, if we're not in the right kind of headspace really to do stuff, then I think all is lost really. So it's just kind of, I started off by thinking about simple things, but based on good psychology, which might help put you in a better position really.
Yeah, fascinating, right? Because it could be argued that the only real solution to climate anxiety is like stopping climate change, right? But that's not what you're saying. You're kind of saying the anxiety bit can lead you to just get into your shell and not do anything and have a shit time. And that actually getting out of that doom loop of just being unable to act allows you to do something which might mean you can cope with the bigger idea a bit better.
Well, exactly, because it seems to me that the secret of climate anxiety, the point about anxiety is it's a whole range of connected negative emotions. And it can be incredibly maladaptive, leads to senses of hopelessness, paralysis, can't do anything, can't even think, or refuse to think about this. But occasionally, anxiety, as anyone who's ever done an examination will know, can push you, can motivate you to act in a much more proactive way. So I was trying to think about mechanisms which would allow you to change one to the other. I agree entirely, of course, that climate anxiety will only go away when we've done something substantive about climate change, of course. But we have to get into a position. And I love this notion that, at all levels of society, that's also true. The ordinary people, as ordinary citizens, but politicians as well. Sometimes when they talk, I kind of get this sense of hopelessness from them as well, that, they've tried this and, the economic cost is just too great, and therefore, and you don't see it in their faces, they've kind of given up on thinking about it. So it just seems, it's thinking back to 2007 and this green revolution. We still need that green revolution, but it has to involve everyone at all levels. And whenever that carbon labeling scheme was tried, it was almost as if everyone started blaming everyone else. So the company said, "Well, the public said they wanted this, and they haven't used the carbon labels to guide them." And of course, people blame the companies, blame the politicians, but it seems to be we're all in the same boat here. It's affecting all of us, and we all need to find mechanisms to put us in a better place, to actually pursue what we need to do to solve the problem of climate change.
So look, we're nearly at the end of this chat with Geoff, and what have I concluded about climate anxiety? I think it's this. Is it real? Kind of. But whether it's an official thing, a thing you can hammer to the wall, feels like it kind of misses the point. The point is that the experience of whatever this thing is can be really paralysing to people. It can often come from a sense that the world is not doing anything about this crisis, that the world is indifferent or it can't act. That's not an irrational thing to conclude at all. For all of the great stuff and the progress that's being made, it can too easily feel like not enough is happening, and that can make us all feel helpless sometimes. And asking ourselves the question, what action should we take, could we take, in the context of a global crisis that could possibly make a difference? It can seem like none of us can do anything that is a hill of beans against the mountain that is the global economy, stuttering geopolitics and the biases and challenges of emergent human psychology. And that paralysis, that feeling, is the problem. And it's a thing we should focus on. For people's mental health, yes. And also like for doing something that makes you feel good about yourself and makes you feel useful in the world, which the response to the climate crisis desperately needs. Helping people with their feelings of climate anxiety is about doing a couple of things. Yes, dismantling fossil fuel capitalism. Let's do that. But while we wait for that to happen, still waiting by the way, we also need to help people with the emotional burden and the sense of powerlessness that we can feel, I can feel, everyone can feel at times. Whether climate anxiety is ever going to make it into that official list of mental disorders, dunno. And by this stage of the conversation, I don't know if I really care. But I do know that you shouldn't be an arsehole about it if you know someone who says they've got climate anxiety. No good ever came of telling someone that something they feel is not a real thing or that they're a snowflake. It was crap when people did that to Harry Farr in World War I when he had shell shock, and it's crap when people do it to people feeling anxious about climate change now. What matters isn't quibbling about whether it's real. It's about helping people to feel okay. And that starts with helping people get unstuck. Here's Geoff with the last word.
Climate anxiety is about an existential threat, so in some sense it's completely justified. But we need to make sure that it doesn't weaken us, it doesn't paralyze us, it doesn't make us feel that we can't do anything. So the whole point of the book is I want to use psychology to help people think about it in positive ways, think about things they can do for themselves so that sustainable action is more likely, so that they feel less invaded by their negative thoughts about climate change. I want to give them some simple things they can do for themselves. And the overarching theme of the book is that climate action and doing something positive about climate change involves all of us at all levels of society. And change really has to start with us as individuals. And I think that when we combine, we are a powerful force. There is an existential threat. There is no doubt about that. We need to get ourselves in the best psychological place to deal with it.
Thank you so much for listening all the way to the end of this episode of Your Brain on Climate with Professor Geoff Beattie. If you liked it, please do share it, spread the word. Personal recommendations are so useful for getting people listening to podcasts. Geoff's book, Understanding Climate Anxiety, is out now, as are loads of other things that he's written. Have a look in the feed a couple of episodes back for a little mini chat I had with Geoff about something else entirely, his fascinating work on optimism bias. Remember, please, if you would like to support this one-man operation, please do so. I pay my guests, I do all the work on this blinking thing. It would be so kind of you, and even a few quid goes a really long way. You can go to patreon.com/yourbrainonclimate to donate. And drop me an email to hello@yourbrainonclimate.com if you'd like to donate some other way or generally want to give me any feedback on the show. I've had some really lovely emails in the last month from people who've enjoyed episodes, particularly the one I did on parenthood a wee bit back with Nina and Sophia, and just some lovely kind words coming. Thank you. It's great to read. Please give the show a review and a rating on things like Apple Podcasts. You've got no idea how much help that is for a small indie podcast. And thank you, as always, to the wonderful Ruth Everett for the voices. Right, that's it. That's all for now. I shall be back soon. And until then, please take care of yourself and others, no matter how grim the climate crisis gets. Okay, bye.